What would you do if you found a billionaire's wallet on the street, filled with cash? Keep it, or return it? For Daniel Carter, a homeless man with nothing to his name, that one decision changed everything. But what he didn't know was that returning the wallet wouldn't be the end of his story, it would be the beginning of a battle against power, deception, and a system that never wanted him to win. Stay with us, because this story is about more than just luck. It's about a man who refused to be forgotten. The morning air in Santa Monica carried the scent of saltwater, a cool breeze drifting in from the Pacific. Seagulls circled overhead, their sharp cries echoing between the high-rise hotels and the worn wooden planks of the pier. Tourists walked along Ocean Avenue, sipping overpriced coffee, snapping pictures, lost in their own lives. Among them, invisible to most, sat Daniel Carter on a weathered bench near the beach. He pulled his tattered jacket tighter around himself, shielding against the early chill. His beard, once neatly trimmed, was now streaked with gray and wild around the edges. His jeans were frayed at the knees, his boots worn nearly to the sole. He shifted uncomfortably, feeling the ache in his bones, a dull reminder of nights spent on concrete, of a bed that was anything but soft. Daniel had not always lived like this. There was a time when his hands smelled of grease and engine oil, when his back ached from hours hunched under car hoods. But he had a roof over his head, a woman waiting for him when he came home. But that was before the cancer took his wife, before the medical bills drowned him, before the bank took their house, leaving him with nothing but a duffel bag and the weight of memories too painful to carry. He ran his thumb over the smooth, cracked glass of a wristwatch, her watch, the only thing he had left of her. The strap was worn, the hands frozen at some forgotten hour. He should have sold it. There had been nights when hunger clawed at his stomach so fiercely that he considered it. But every time, he tucked it back into his pocket. Some things, he decided, were worth more than survival. A group of joggers passed by, barely sparing him a glance. He was used to it. People either pretended not to see him, or they looked at him with quiet pity, as if homelessness was a disease they might catch. He didn't blame them. The city was full of people like him, ghosts drifting between street corners and shelters, waiting for something, anything, to change. As he stared at the waves rolling onto shore, something caught his eye, a flash of dark leather, just a few feet from his bench. A wallet. Daniel frowned. It must have fallen from someone passing by. He glanced around, searching for its owner, but the street was busy, a blur of moving faces and hurried footsteps. Bending down, he picked it up. The leather was smooth, expensive. He flipped it open. Inside was a thick stack of bills, hundreds, maybe thousands. His fingers hovered over them for a moment. He swallowed, feeling the weight of his empty stomach, the exhaustion of another night sleeping under a bridge. $5,000, maybe more, enough to buy food, a room for weeks, maybe even a bus ticket out of this place. His pulse quickened. No one had seen him pick it up. He could take it, disappear for a while, feel human again. Then his gaze shifted to the ID card tucked inside. Ethan Caldwell. The name sounded familiar. He slid the card out, his eyes scanning the face staring back at him, a man in his late 30s. Sharp suit, confident smirk. It clicked. Ethan Caldwell, the billionaire tech mogul. He had seen him on the news, talking about artificial intelligence, investments, the future of business. A man who lived in skyscrapers, whose morning coffee probably cost more than Daniel's entire week. The world wasn't fair. Ethan Caldwell had more money than he could ever spend, and Daniel had nothing. He could take the money, or he could give it back. He exhaled sharply, rubbing his thumb over the watch again. After a long moment, he made his decision. The city buzzed with morning energy as Daniel made his way through the crowded streets of downtown Los Angeles. The towering glass buildings reflected the golden sunlight, a stark contrast to the concrete sidewalks beneath his worn-out boots. He clutched the wallet tightly in his calloused hand, his mind playing out different scenarios. What if they didn't believe him? What if they assumed he had stolen it? He had faced enough judgment in recent years to know how quickly people made assumptions based on appearances. Still, turning back was not an option. He had made his choice, and he intended to follow through with it. As he approached Caldwell Enterprises, the sheer grandeur of the building made him pause. The massive structure loomed over the street, its polished steel and glass facade exuding power and wealth. People in tailored suits hurried through the revolving doors, their conversations blending into a hum of business dealings and high-stakes negotiations. Daniel took a deep breath and stepped inside. The air-conditioned lobby was pristine, with marble floors that gleamed under the artificial lighting. A grand chandelier hung overhead, its crystals refracting light in a dazzling display. To one side, a receptionist was directing visitors, while a group of executives chatted near a sleek coffee bar. He had barely taken a few steps when a uniformed security guard intercepted him. "Sir, can I help you?" The man's voice was firm, professional, but there was an unmistakable edge of suspicion in his tone. His eyes swept over Daniel's disheveled appearance, the frayed jacket, the scuffed boots, the years of hardship etched into his face. Daniel straightened his posture, holding up the wallet. "I need to return this. It belongs to Ethan Caldwell." The guard's expression hardened. "You can't just walk in here asking for Mr. Caldwell. Do you have an appointment?" "No," Daniel admitted, "but this is important." The guard exchanged a glance with another officer behind the desk. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Daniel's grip on the wallet tightened. "I'm not looking for trouble. I just want to return this to its owner." "Look, buddy," the guard said, lowering his voice, "I don't know how you got that, but if you think this is some kind of scam." Before he could finish, a woman's voice cut through the tension. "What's going on here?" Daniel turned to see a well-dressed woman approaching, her sharp heels clicking against the floor. She was in her mid-30s, her auburn hair pulled into a sleek ponytail, a leather-bound planner tucked under one arm. Unlike the guards, she wasn't looking at him with suspicion, she was looking at the wallet in his hand. "I found this," Daniel explained. "It belongs to Ethan Caldwell." Her brows lifted in surprise. She reached for the wallet, flipping it open to check the ID inside. After a moment, she glanced up, studying him carefully. "You didn't take anything?" she asked. Daniel shook his head. "Not a cent." For a beat, she seemed to weigh his words. Then she gave a small nod. "Come with me." The guards hesitated, but she shot them a look. "I'll take responsibility." Daniel followed her past the security desk and into the elevator. As the doors closed, she glanced at him again. "I'm Lisa Harper," she said, "Mr. Caldwell's executive assistant." "Daniel Carter," he replied. She studied him a moment longer before nodding. "You're lucky I walked by when I did. Security doesn't usually let anyone past without clearance." Daniel smirked dryly. "Yeah, I got that impression." The elevator ride was swift, opening to a sprawling office space with floor-to-ceiling windows showcasing a breathtaking view of the city. Employees bustled about, some glancing curiously at Daniel as he walked past. Lisa led him through a set of double doors into an expansive office. Behind a sleek glass desk sat Ethan Caldwell. The billionaire barely looked up from his laptop as Lisa approached. He was younger than Daniel had expected, mid to late 30s, his tailored suit flawless, his posture exuding the quiet confidence of someone who controlled everything around him. Lisa cleared her throat. "Mr. Caldwell, this man found your wallet and returned it." Ethan finally glanced up, his sharp blue eyes flicked from Lisa to Daniel, then to the wallet she set on his desk. He picked it up, flipped through its contents, and let out a quiet hum of acknowledgement. "Well," he said, "that's unexpected." Daniel waited, but no words of gratitude followed. Ethan leaned back in his chair, regarding him with an expression that was more curiosity than appreciation. "I assume you're here for a reward?" Daniel frowned. "No, just returning what isn't mine." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Really? 5,000 in cash, credit cards, an address that leads to a penthouse. And you didn't take even $1? "That's right." Ethan drummed his fingers against the desk, as if weighing the truth in Daniel's words. Then he smirked. "That's a first." Lisa, standing beside him, shot him a glance. "Mr. Caldwell." Ethan waved a hand. "Relax, Lisa. It's just, people don't usually act without some kind of self-interest." He turned his gaze back to Daniel. "What do you want, then?" "Nothing," Daniel said simply. "I saw the wallet. I returned it." Ethan studied him for a long moment. Then, to Lisa's visible annoyance, he laughed. "You're an interesting guy, Carter," he mused. I'll admit, I don't get many surprises these days. Lisa sighed. Maybe instead of questioning his honesty, you should consider helping him. Ethan tilted his head, thoughtful. Then, as if struck by an idea, he nodded. All right, he said, let's test that honesty. Daniel narrowed his eyes. What do you mean? Ethan leaned forward, a calculating glint in his eyes. I don't believe anyone does something for nothing. You say you're different? Prove it. Work for me. Daniel blinked. Excuse me? You heard me, Ethan said, smirking. 1 month. A trial period. If you fail, you're out. If you impress me, who knows? Maybe you'll get something better than a thank you. Lisa looked exasperated. Ethan, this isn't a game. It's not, Ethan countered. It's an opportunity. His gaze flicked back to Daniel. Unless, of course, you're afraid you can't handle it. Daniel had expected a lot of things when he walked into that building. But a job offer from a billionaire wasn't one of them. He wasn't sure if it was an insult, a joke, or something else entirely. But he also knew this might be the only chance he'd get. He extended his hand. I'm in. Ethan grinned, shaking it. Good. Let's see if you can survive the month. The moment Daniel stepped into Caldwell Enterprises as an employee, he felt the weight of judgment pressing down on him. The pristine white walls, the high-tech machinery humming in the background, the scent of polished steel, it all stood in stark contrast to the streets he had called home for years. This was a different world, one where people wore expensive suits instead of second-hand coats, where coffee came from high-end espresso machines instead of charity lines. And everyone was staring at him. He could hear the whispers even if they weren't loud. That's the guy? The homeless one? I heard Ethan hired him as some kind of experiment. There's no way he actually belongs here. Daniel kept his head down, walking through the sleek corridors of the engineering department. He had spent years working with his hands, fixing cars, understanding machines better than most people understood themselves. But here, he wasn't seen as a skilled mechanic, he was a spectacle. A curiosity at best, a mistake at worst. Lisa led him through a set of doors into the industrial section of the company, where rows of workbenches were lined with intricate electrical components and unfinished machinery. This was where Caldwell Enterprises was developing its next-generation electric engines. A project that, according to the company's PR, would revolutionize the automobile industry. This is where you'll be working, Lisa said, handing him a temporary ID badge. You'll assist with diagnostics, repairs, and assembly. Prove yourself. And maybe this job won't just be temporary. Daniel nodded, slipping the badge around his neck. He had no intention of failing. But he wasn't naive. He could feel the tension in the air, the silent resentment from the engineers already stationed at their workstations. He wasn't welcome here. Then, a voice cut through the air. This has to be a joke. Daniel turned to see a man in his early 50s. Dressed in a sharp navy suit, arms crossed over his chest. His graying hair was neatly combed, his expression one of absolute disdain. The kind of man who had spent years building his career and didn't appreciate curveballs. Richard, Lisa greeted, her voice guarded. This is Daniel Carter. He'll be joining the team as part of Mr. Caldwell's trial program. Richard Powell, the head of the engineering department. Richard scoffed, his eyes narrowing as he looked Daniel up and down. A trial program. Right, let me guess. This is some sort of PR stunt? Lisa's expression remained neutral, but there was an edge to her tone. Ethan sees potential in him. I see a liability. Richard shot back. He stepped closer to Daniel, lowering his voice. You don't belong here. This isn't a charity. Daniel met his gaze without flinching. I didn't ask for charity. Richard let out a low chuckle. Let's see if you can prove that. He turned to one of the senior engineers. Get him started. Give him something appropriate. The words dripped with condescension. Minutes later, Daniel found himself standing in front of a row of machinery, a mop and a bucket at his feet. Your first task, the engineer said, barely hiding his smirk, is to clean all the workstations. And don't miss a spot. Daniel knew what this was. They weren't testing his skills, they were testing his patience. Seeing if he would break. He glanced over at Lisa, who stood by the entrance, watching but saying nothing. This was his fight. Without a word, Daniel picked up the mop and started cleaning. The hours dragged on. He scrubbed floors, wiped down workbenches, and listened to the quiet snickers of the engineers passing by. At one point, a wrench, accidentally, slipped from a nearby table, landing just inches from his foot with a loud clang. "Careful," one of the engineers muttered, feigning innocence. Daniel clenched his jaw but said nothing. He wasn't here to start fights. Lisa wasn't fooled. She had seen enough workplace politics to recognize when someone was being pushed out. But without proof, she couldn't step in, not yet. By the time Daniel finished, his hands ached from gripping the mop handle. He set it aside, rolling his shoulders as he exhaled slowly. This was just the first day. If they thought they could break him, they were in for a surprise. Then, as if fate had decided to throw him a bone, a loud beeping sound filled the room. One of the prototype engines on the main workbench was malfunctioning. The digital display flickered, red warning lights flashing across the interface. A small group of engineers rushed over, their conversation turning into rapid technical jargon. "What the hell happened? The diagnostic system isn't detecting the fault. This could set us back days." Daniel, out of pure habit, moved closer. He didn't understand every line of code they were throwing around, but he understood machines. He had spent years under the hoods of cars, learning the way engines breathed, the way they failed. "Check the secondary relay," he muttered under his breath. No one heard him. He stepped closer. "It's not the main circuit board. It's a faulty connection in the secondary relay." This time, one of the engineers glanced at him, more annoyed than interested. "And how the hell would you know that?" Daniel ignored the hostility. "Just check it." With a scoff, the engineer humored him, opening the panel and examining the secondary relay. A moment later, his expression shifted. "Shit, he's right." There was a brief silence. Then another engineer hesitated before nodding. "That would explain the failure loop." Lisa arched a brow, impressed. Even Richard, standing off to the side, didn't look pleased but seemed to be reevaluating his earlier assumptions. Ethan's voice cut through the silence. Well, he said, stepping into the room. "Looks like our guest might actually be useful." Daniel turned, meeting his gaze. Ethan smirked. "Guess you get to stay another day." Richard, arms still crossed, narrowed his eyes. He said nothing, but Daniel could see it, the calculation, the irritation. The man wasn't done with him yet. As Ethan left, Lisa gave Daniel a small nod, a silent acknowledgement that he had passed the first hurdle. But he wasn't naive. Someone here wanted him gone, and they weren't going to stop until they got what they wanted. The scent of heated metal filled the air, blending with the faint hum of machinery in the engineering bay. Daniel wiped the sweat from his forehead as he focused on the motor in front of him. His hands, though calloused from years of labor, moved with precision as he examined the prototype's internal wiring. Around him, the other engineers worked at their stations, occasionally throwing him side glances, some curious, others indifferent, and a few openly resentful. For days, he had kept his head down, refusing to let the whispered judgments or menial tasks shake him. He did what he was assigned, learned the layout of the facility, and familiarized himself with the advanced systems Caldwell Enterprises was developing. No one was willing to explain much to him, but he didn't need them to. Machines spoke a universal language, one he understood better than most people. Then, the alarms went off. A sharp, high-pitched beeping filled the room, followed by a thick stream of smoke billowing from one of the main test benches. Engineers scrambled back as a few rushed toward the control panel, shouting over each other. What happened? The cooling system's failing, pressure's building too fast. Daniel's instincts kicked in immediately. He grabbed a pair of insulated gloves and lunged forward, flipping the emergency shutoff switch. The motor let out a loud hiss before settling into a low whine. The smoke gradually thinning. Silence hung heavy in the room, interrupted only by the distant hum of ventilation systems working to clear the air. Then came the voice he was expecting. Well, that didn't take long. Richard Powell stepped forward, arms crossed, his expression unreadable except for the unmistakable gleam of satisfaction in his eyes. Daniel straightened. That wasn't me. Richard scoffed. Then who was it? Because you were the last one working on that unit. Murmurs rippled through the group. A few engineers exchanged glances, uncertainty creeping into their faces. The accident had happened too fast for anyone to fully process what went wrong. But all eyes were now turning toward Daniel. Lisa entered the room just in time to hear Richard's accusation. She scanned the scene, her sharp eyes assessing the damage before narrowing at the older man. "You're saying Daniel caused this?" "I'm saying," Richard drawled, "that ever since he got here, we've had issues. This is a billion-dollar project. Lisa, we can't afford mistakes." Ethan arrived moments later, his usual composed demeanor masking any immediate reaction. He glanced at the still smoking unit, then at Daniel. "Tell me exactly what happened." Daniel held his ground. "I shut it down before it got worse. I didn't touch anything that would have caused that failure." Ethan studied him for a long moment before turning to one of the engineers. "Can you confirm that?" The man hesitated. "I mean, he was working on it." Richard smirked. "Exactly." He turned back to Ethan. "This experiment of yours, bringing in someone off the streets, has already cost us time. Do we really need to wait for it to cost us money?" Ethan's jaw tightened. "Enough." He exhaled sharply before fixing Daniel with a measured stare. "One more issue, and you're out. No warnings, no second chances." Daniel nodded, though a flicker of doubt crossed his mind. Had he missed something? Lisa wasn't convinced. She wasn't about to let this go without a deeper look. That night, while most of the facility emptied, she stayed behind, logging into the internal security system. Her fingers flew over the keyboard as she navigated through hours of surveillance footage. She sped through timestamps, watching the lab from different angles. Then she found it. Minutes before the accident, the feed showed Richard at the main terminal, keying in a sequence. A moment later, the footage cut out, only for a few seconds, but enough to raise suspicion. Her pulse quickened. That wasn't a malfunction. That was deliberate. She grabbed her phone, ready to call Ethan, but paused. She needed more proof. Meanwhile, Daniel sat alone in the break room, staring at the ID badge clipped to his chest. He thought back to the accusations, the murmurs, the way people looked at him as if they had expected him to fail from the start. What if they were right? What if he didn't belong here? Lisa walked in, catching the conflicted look on his face. She hesitated before sitting across from him. "You didn't do anything wrong." Daniel didn't respond immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than usual. "Doesn't matter if I did or not. They already think I did." She set her phone down on the table. "I have reason to believe Richard tampered with the system. But the security footage isn't enough. Someone covered their tracks." Daniel ran a hand through his hair. He had spent years surviving on instinct, reading people, understanding when he was being set up. This wasn't just a coincidence. It was deliberate. And Richard wasn't done. The next day, Richard stood in the corner of the engineering bay, watching Daniel with an amused expression. He hadn't been reprimanded for the accident. If anything, Ethan's warning had given him more confidence. Daniel could feel it, the subtle shifts in conversation when he walked by, the wary glances from those who now saw him as a liability. He had barely gotten a foot in the door, and someone was already trying to push him back out. He wasn't going to let that happen. That evening, as the facility quieted down, Richard accessed one of the restricted consoles. His fingers moved across the keyboard, entering a modified command sequence. This time, the sabotage would be more severe. If Daniel was anywhere near the test setup when it went off, there would be no saving him. The test chamber hummed with energy as the engineers prepared for the next phase of the prototype evaluation. The reinforced glass separated them from the testing platform, where the experimental engine stood mounted on a steel rig. A dozen screens displayed live diagnostics, monitoring everything from temperature fluctuations to fuel efficiency. Daniel stood at the far end of the room, keeping a careful eye on the readings. He wasn't supposed to be leading this test, just observing, but something about the numbers flashing on the screen didn't sit right with him. The pressure levels were rising too fast. "Hey," he called out to one of the engineers. "Those readings seem off. The coolant flow isn't stabilizing." The man barely spared him a glance. "It's within the margin. Just let the system do its job." Daniel frowned, his gut twisting with unease. He had spent years around engines, enough to know when one was about to fail. But before he could say anything else, an ear-splitting bang ripped through the room. The engine exploded. A shockwave rattled the glass walls as a burst of flame erupted from the testing rig. The impact sent people stumbling backward, Alarms blaring in warning. Smoke billowed from the machinery. And through the chaos, Daniel spotted a figure on the floor, one of the junior engineers. Clutching his arm, his face contorted in pain. "Get him out of there," someone shouted. Security and medical personnel rushed in, extinguishing the flames and escorting the injured engineer out of the room. The rest of the team stood frozen, their eyes darting between each other in panic and confusion. Then, as the smoke began to clear, all eyes turned to one person. "Daniel, you were the last one near the system," an older engineer accused, his voice laced with anger. "What the hell did you do?" Richard stepped forward, his expression controlled but unmistakably triumphant. "This is exactly what I warned you about." He turned to Ethan, who had just arrived, his sharp blue eyes scanning the wreckage before landing on Daniel. "How many more mistakes do we have to tolerate before we cut our losses?" Daniel clenched his fists. "I didn't cause this," Richard scoffed. "Oh, really? Then why was this failure linked to the exact system you were monitoring?" Ethan's patience was clearly running thin. He exhaled sharply, rubbing his temple before fixing Daniel with a hard stare. "Enough. You're suspended. Effective immediately. Security will escort you out." Lisa, who had just entered, stiffened. "Ethan, wait." Ethan cut her off. "No, this isn't up for discussion. We'll review the logs, but I won't risk another incident like this." Daniel knew there was no point in arguing. Without proof, it was his word against everyone else's. As the guards led him out of the facility, he cast a glance back toward the wreckage. He wasn't just being pushed out, he was being set up. And he needed to find out why. Lisa sat at her desk, frustration tightening in her chest. Something wasn't right. She had spent enough years in this company to know when a situation smelled rotten. The timing of the explosion, the way Richard had jumped on the accusation, none of it felt like a coincidence. Determined to get to the bottom of it, she logged into the internal server and accessed the backup logs from the test. Her fingers flew over the keyboard, navigating through layers of encrypted data. Then she found it. The system had recorded an anomaly 30 minutes before the test, an unauthorized manual override on the coolant pressure. The change had been subtle, designed to look like a minor fluctuation, but it had caused the temperature to spike beyond safe levels. And the override had been initiated from Richard's workstation. Lisa's heart pounded. She had the proof she needed. She reached for her phone, ready to call Ethan, but just as she was about to dial, the screen of her computer glitched. A loading icon appeared, and in an instant, the files she had just accessed disappeared. Her stomach dropped. Someone was covering their tracks in real time. She tried to retrieve the backup, but every copy had been wiped clean. It was as if the data had never existed. Whoever was behind this wasn't just sabotaging Daniel. They were erasing evidence. Ethan sat in his office, staring at the city skyline. The day had spiraled into a disaster, and he wasn't sure what to think anymore. A part of him knew something was off about the whole situation. Daniel's reaction hadn't been that of a guilty man, and yet, the evidence, however circumstantial, kept pointing in one direction. Lisa entered without knocking, her expression tense. "We need to talk." Ethan leaned back in his chair. "If this is about Carter, I'm not changing my decision." "You should," Lisa said firmly, "because he's being framed." Ethan's gaze sharpened. "What are you talking about?" Lisa took a breath, trying to steady her frustration. "I found a data trail showing Richard tampered with the system. He manually altered the coolant pressure before the test, which led to the explosion." Ethan sat up straighter. "Do you have proof?" Lisa hesitated, her jaw tightening. "I did, but it's gone. Someone wiped the files while I was reviewing them." Ethan's eyes narrowed. He didn't like making decisions based on gut feelings, but he trusted Lisa's instincts. If she was this convinced, it meant something wasn't adding up. Still, he couldn't ignore the optics. "Even if I believe you, I can't reinstate Carter without evidence. The board won't allow it." Lisa clenched her fists. "So you're just going to let Richard get away with this?" Ethan exhaled slowly. "I need time to figure out the next move." Lisa crossed her arms. "Daniel doesn't have time. He's already halfway out the door." Ethan rubbed his temple again, his frustration mounting. He hated being manipulated, and right now, it felt like someone was pulling the strings behind the scenes. "Let's say you're right," he he said finally. Why would Richard want Carter gone this badly? Lisa shook her head. That's what we need to find out. Daniel sat on the curb outside Caldwell Enterprises, his bag slung over his shoulder. The past few days had been a battle, and now, it felt like he had lost. But he wasn't done. If someone wanted him gone, there was a reason, and if Lisa was right about the sabotage, that meant Richard, or whoever was behind this, was willing to go to extreme lengths to make sure he didn't stay. That told Daniel one thing. He was onto something. Daniel sat at the edge of a worn-out bench outside a rundown diner, staring at the steam rising from a cup of black coffee. He hadn't touched it yet. The bitterness in his gut had nothing to do with caffeine. He had spent years surviving on instinct, knowing when to fight and when to walk away. But this wasn't the kind of battle he could afford to lose. The explosion had nearly cost him everything. If Lisa hadn't been digging into the logs, he wouldn't have known Richard was pulling the strings behind the scenes. But knowing wasn't enough. He needed proof, something undeniable that would force Ethan to see the truth. He glanced at the phone Lisa had given him before she left. "Call me if you find something." That was what she had said. But now, she wasn't answering. Lisa had been his only ally. Now, she was gone. His grip tightened around the cup. If they thought pushing her out would make him give up, they were wrong. Daniel walked for miles that night, thinking, planning. The city was never truly dark. Los Angeles pulsed with light, even in its emptiest streets. He passed through alleyways where neon signs flickered, their colors casting distorted reflections in puddles along the sidewalk. Somewhere in the distance, a police siren wailed before fading into the noise of traffic. By the time he reached his destination, the office building loomed above him, cold and impersonal. Caldwell Enterprises, the place that had nearly given him a second chance before trying to crush him. He wasn't going to let them. Daniel knew breaking in wasn't an option, but he had spent enough time in the facility to know where to look. The maintenance crew worked late, their schedules predictable. He waited, blending into the shadows near a loading dock, until a janitor propped the door open for a smoke break. He slipped inside. The halls were dimly lit, most of the offices empty for the night. He moved quickly, retracing the steps he had memorized over the last few weeks. If Richard was covering his tracks, the data wouldn't be in the main system. It would be buried somewhere deeper, somewhere harder to erase. The engineering floor was silent, the hum of idle machines filling the space. He made his way toward the restricted access terminals, knowing exactly what he needed to do. His hands hovered over the keyboard. He wasn't a hacker. He barely knew how half of this security worked. But he didn't have to be an expert. He just had to be smart enough to find what Richard had overlooked. A few keystrokes brought up the archived reports. His eyes scanned the screen, searching for timestamps from the night of the explosion. Most of it had been wiped, but whoever had done it hadn't been careful enough. There were fragments of logs still left, bits of corrupted data, missing pieces of a puzzle someone had tried to burn. Then he found it. A line of code, buried under system redundancies. It wasn't just Richard. Someone higher up had approved the changes. Daniel exhaled slowly. This wasn't just about him anymore. He copied the data onto a flash drive and turned to leave, only to find Richard standing in the doorway. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Richard's face was unreadable, but there was no mistaking the tension in his stance. "You just don't know when to quit, do you?" Richard finally said, his voice quiet but dangerous. Daniel pocketed the drive. "I don't like losing." Richard stepped forward, slow and deliberate. "You have no idea what you're getting yourself into." Daniel held his ground. "Then why are you so afraid of me finding out?" Richard chuckled, shaking his head. "You think you're fighting for something noble? Ethan isn't your savior, and this company isn't your redemption. It's a machine, Carter. It chews people up and spits them out. And you?" He took another step closer. "You were never supposed to be here." Daniel had spent years being told what he couldn't do, where he didn't belong. But he wasn't the same man who had walked into Caldwell Enterprises a few weeks ago. He leaned in slightly, his voice steady. "Guess we'll find out, won't we?" Richard's expression darkened. He knew, and Daniel knew, this wasn't over. Not even close. Daniel knew that waiting around for Richard's next move would be a mistake. The man had already proven he was willing to play dirty. And if Daniel wanted to survive, he needed to turn the tables. He had spent enough time being on the defensive. It was time to push back. One evening, while most of the engineers had left for the day, Daniel walked past a group lingering near the break room, talking in hushed tones. He slowed his steps just enough to let them overhear as he muttered to himself. Direct access to Ethan. This could change everything, he said, shaking his head as if debating whether he was ready for such an opportunity. He didn't look back as he walked away, but he knew exactly who had heard him. By the next morning, the rumors had spread. Did you hear? Ethan's bringing Carter onto the prototype evaluation team. That can't be right. He's barely been here a few weeks. Guess Ethan sees something in him. That was all it took. By noon, Richard was fuming. Daniel could see it in the way the man clenched his jaw whenever he passed. If there was one thing someone like Richard couldn't stand, it was losing control. Daniel just had to wait for him to make a move. It didn't take long. The next day, a critical engine test was scheduled, one involving a new high-output prototype. This wasn't a routine check. This was the kind of experiment that could either bring Caldwell Enterprises a major breakthrough or set them back by months. And Daniel knew Richard wouldn't let him walk away from it unscathed. When the test began, Daniel was positioned near the monitoring panel, analyzing the readings alongside the other engineers. The engine roared to life. The complex network of circuits and fuel systems working in sync, at least for the first few minutes. Then, the warning lights flashed red. Overheating, someone announced. Coolant levels are dropping too fast. Another added. Daniel's eyes darted across the displays, his mind processing the data. This wasn't just a minor fluctuation, this was sabotage. Someone had tampered with the pressure control system, allowing the engine's core temperature to skyrocket. If it wasn't shut down immediately, the entire unit could explode. He moved toward the emergency override panel, but a hand shot out, stopping him. You don't have clearance, an engineer snapped. Daniel's chest tightened. If we don't shut it down now, the containment system will fail. Richard stepped forward, a smirk barely concealed on his face. We follow protocol here, Carter, and that means only authorized personnel handle emergency overrides. The engine's frame vibrated violently, the metal groaning under the stress. Daniel had seconds to act. Ignoring the hands trying to hold him back, he lunged forward, bypassing the controls and slamming the emergency shutdown button. For a tense moment, nothing happened. Then, the engine let out a deafening hiss as the cooling systems kicked in. The temperature readings dropped, and the vibrations ceased. Daniel exhaled sharply. Disaster had been avoided, barely. But before he could even turn around, Richard's voice rang out. Security. 2 guards entered the room, their expressions unreadable as they approached. Richard gestured toward Daniel. He just violated our security protocol. He has no authorization to interfere with classified systems. Daniel stared at him, stunned. Are you kidding me? I just stopped a meltdown. Richard crossed his arms. Or maybe you caused it in the first place. A voice cut through the tension. Enough. Ethan stood in the doorway, his gaze locked on Daniel. The room fell silent as Ethan stepped inside, his eyes sweeping over the monitors. The stunned expressions of the engineers. The remnants of smoke still lingering in the air. He turned to Richard. Explain. Richard straightened. Carter overstepped. Again. We have protocols for a reason. And he took it upon himself to bypass them. He saved your entire damn lab. One of the engineers blurted out before he could stop himself. The man went pale as soon as he realized he had spoken out of turn. But the words were already in the air. Ethan's expression didn't change. He turned to Daniel. Walk me through what happened. Daniel didn't sugarcoat anything. He explained the readings, the rapid coolant loss, the clear signs of tampering. He didn't have proof of who was behind it, but he didn't need to say it outright. The way Ethan's gaze flickered toward Richard showed he had already drawn his own conclusions. Ethan exhaled slowly, rubbing the bridge of his nose. Take him to security, he said finally. Daniel's stomach dropped, but then Ethan continued. And review the security logs for the last 24 hours. I want a full report on who accessed the system before the test. Richard's jaw tightened. For the first time, real concern flashed across his face. Daniel didn't resist as the guards escorted him out. But for the first time since this battle began, he felt something shift. Ethan was starting to ask the right questions. The atmosphere inside Caldwell Enterprises was tense. Ever since Ethan ordered an internal investigation into the recent system failures, the entire company had been on edge. Engineers whispered in the hallways, glancing over their shoulders. Supervisors kept their doors closed longer than usual. No one wanted to be caught in the middle of what was quickly turning into a war between power and principle. Daniel sat alone in a small conference room, staring at the reflection of fluorescent lights on the table's polished surface. He had been here before, in different ways, different places, sitting in an office where people decided his fate while pretending to listen to him. The door opened, and 2 security personnel stepped in, followed by Richard Powell. The man carried himself with the confidence of someone who knew the outcome before the verdict was even read. "Mr. Carter," Richard said smoothly, taking the seat across from him. "I assume you understand the seriousness of the situation?" Daniel kept his face neutral. "Which one? The sabotage I didn't commit, or the investigation that conveniently lost all its evidence?" Richard smirked, clasping his hands together on the table. "You don't belong here, Carter. You never did. It was only a matter of time before things fell apart. This company isn't a charity. And frankly, your presence is an embarrassment." Daniel leaned forward. "You sound nervous." "Richard, what's wrong? Afraid I might actually prove I'm not the problem?" Richard's smile barely faltered. "Afraid? No. Annoyed? Yes. People like you always overestimate their importance. You think Ethan is going to throw away his company for a washed-up mechanic?" Before Daniel could answer, one of the security guards spoke into his earpiece and nodded. "They're ready for him." Richard stood, straightening his tie. "Let's go hear what the board has to say, shall we?" The hallway leading to the main conference room felt longer than usual. Daniel walked between the 2 guards, ignoring the stares of employees who stepped aside as he passed. Some looked curious, others avoided eye contact altogether. Inside, the board members sat in their usual seats, their expressions unreadable. Ethan stood near the head of the table, arms crossed, his gaze unreadable. Lisa was nowhere in sight. One of the senior board members cleared his throat. "Mr. Carter, based on our internal review, we have found substantial evidence linking you to the recent security breaches and mechanical failures within our systems. Given the gravity of these issues, we are considering terminating your contract immediately." Daniel remained silent. He had learned long ago that arguing without leverage was a waste of breath. Another executive spoke up. "The reports indicate that files were deleted from our mainframe from a terminal registered under your ID." Daniel's jaw tightened. "That's impossible." Richard took a step forward. "It's not impossible. It's fact, and quite frankly, it's a pattern. First, a security breach, then a system failure, and now, deleted files. Either you're the unluckiest man alive, or you're exactly what we suspected from the start, a fraud looking for an easy way in." Ethan exhaled sharply, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Enough," he said, his voice calmer than expected. "We all know something doesn't add up here. But the evidence," he hesitated, his frustration evident. "The evidence is against you, Daniel." Daniel met his gaze. "And if that evidence was manipulated?" Ethan didn't respond immediately. Richard, however, chuckled. "Ah, of course. The grand conspiracy theory. Let me guess, you're innocent. And I'm the villain?" Before Daniel could answer, the door to the boardroom swung open. Lisa walked in, heads turned, surprised to see her after her suspension. But it wasn't just her presence that caught their attention, it was the small flash drive she held in her hand. "Apologies for the interruption," she said, her tone steady, but there was an unmistakable sharpness to it. "I think the board will want to see this before making any final decisions." Richard's expression darkened slightly. "Lisa, you've been relieved of." "Save it," she interrupted, plugging the flash drive into the conference room display. "Because this changes everything." The screen flickered to life. A recovered security feed played in front of them, displaying footage from the night of the most recent sabotage. At first, it was nothing out of the ordinary, just an empty lab. Inactive screens. But then, a figure entered the frame. Richard Powell. He moved quickly, accessing the central terminal and inputting a command sequence. The video was slightly distorted. Whoever had erased it had done a good job, but Lisa had managed to recover enough to prove his involvement. Murmurs spread across the room. One of the board members turned toward Richard. Is this real? Lisa crossed her arms. I had a backup of the system logs. Someone tried to erase them, but they didn't cover all their tracks. Ethan stepped forward, eyes locked on Richard. You manipulated the system, he said, his voice cold. You framed him. Richard opened his mouth, but for the first time, there was no smooth comeback. Lisa glanced at Ethan. I'd say this justifies a deeper investigation. Wouldn't you? Silence. Then, slowly, Ethan nodded. Richard's shoulders tensed. He wasn't done fighting yet. But at this moment, he had lost control of the narrative. Daniel exhaled quietly. It wasn't over. Not yet, but for the first time since stepping foot in this company. He wasn't the one on trial. The tension inside Caldwell Enterprises had reached a boiling point. The once sleek and orderly corridors now buzzed with hushed conversations. Employees speaking in careful whispers, wary of who might be listening. Daniel could feel the weight of every glance thrown his way, each one laced with skepticism, doubt, or outright hostility. But something had shifted. He was no longer just a target. He had become a symbol of something larger, something Richard and his allies wanted to bury at all costs. Ethan had spent the past few days in his office, reviewing files, cross-checking reports, and piecing together what had been happening right under his nose. The evidence against Richard was damning. But what frustrated Ethan the most was how long he had allowed himself to be manipulated. He wasn't a fool. He had spent years outmaneuvering corporate sharks and competitors. But somehow, inside his own company, a coup had been forming, and he hadn't seen it coming. Enough. At precisely 9 a.m., Ethan called for an emergency board meeting. When he entered the conference room, Richard was already there, leaning back in his chair with a smug expression, arms crossed as if he had already won. Around the long, polished table sat the key decision-makers of Caldwell Enterprises, the senior executives, legal advisors, and board members, all waiting to see what their CEO had to say. Ethan didn't waste time. All disciplinary actions against Daniel Carter are suspended, he announced, his voice steady but firm. Effective immediately. I'm launching a full investigation into the recent sabotage incidents, including the manipulated test results and deleted security footage. A murmur spread across the room, some board members exchanging uneasy glances. Richard, however, merely chuckled. This is a mistake, Richard said, shaking his head. You're seriously going to damage your own credibility over this? Over him? He gestured vaguely, as if Daniel were nothing more than a stain on the company's reputation. Ethan met his gaze without blinking. I'd be damaging my credibility if I let corruption fester under my own roof. And I'd be a fool if I didn't see exactly who's behind it. Richard's smile didn't fade, but his fingers twitched against the table, an involuntary sign of irritation. One of the senior board members cleared his throat. Ethan, you have to understand the optics of this. You hired a man off the streets with no formal qualifications. Now, with all these incidents happening under his presence, public perception is already turning against us. Another member nodded. Our investors are concerned. The stock has already taken a hit due to the recent bad press. If this continues, Ethan let out a slow breath. I don't make decisions based on fear. And I won't let this company be run by men who think they can bend the truth to fit their narrative. He turned to the legal team. I want Richard Powell placed on immediate administrative leave while the investigation is conducted. That wiped the smirk off Richard's face. You're out of your mind. Richard spat. You think you can just push me out? The board has the power to override you, Ethan. And trust me, they will. Ethan tilted his head. Then let them. Silence. The statement lingered, settling heavily over the room. Richard narrowed his eyes, as if trying to read Ethan's next move. But Ethan had never been one to show his cards too early. Finally, one of the executives leaned forward. If this is the course of action you want to take, Ethan, you should know there are consequences. Richard leaned in, seizing the opportunity. That's right. If you don't back down, the board will be forced to vote on your leadership. You could lose everything. Ethan's jaw tightened. He had expected this, but he wasn't backing down. Meanwhile, Daniel had been keeping a low profile. But Lisa wasn't. She had been gathering whatever pieces of evidence she could salvage from the company's systems. Late at night, she met with Daniel in a quiet parking lot, handing him a USB drive. "This is what's left," she said. "Whoever's cleaning up their tracks is fast. But this shows just enough to prove Richard isn't working alone." Daniel took it, his fingers closing over the small device. "Do you think it'll be enough?" Lisa hesitated. "Maybe, but the real problem isn't just Richard. It's the people above him." The weight of her words sank into Daniel's chest. This wasn't just about a corrupt executive. It was about control, who held the power, and who they were willing to destroy to keep it. The next morning, the headlines hit. Anonymous sources had leaked an internal report questioning Ethan's decision-making. A well-crafted story painted him as reckless, a man who was prioritizing personal crusades over company stability. The whispers about Daniel had spread beyond the office, now bleeding into investor discussions and news cycles. Ethan Caldwell's risky bet. Is a CEO's experiment putting a billion-dollar empire at risk? The writing was on the wall. A vote was being called. The board was preparing to strip Ethan of his position. But before that could happen, something unexpected occurred. One of the senior engineers, someone who had kept his head down through all of this, finally stepped forward. He had seen Richard tampering with the systems, had known about the cover-ups but had been too afraid to speak. Now, with the walls closing in, he couldn't stay silent any longer. He requested to speak at the next board meeting, prepared to tell the truth. But before he could testify, an accident happened. Late that night, the engineer was involved in a sudden car crash, seemingly random. But Lisa and Daniel knew better. The timing was too perfect, too calculated. Someone had sent a message. This wasn't just about Daniel anymore. Whoever was behind this was willing to silence anyone who stood in their way. The conference hall of Caldwell Enterprises was packed, yet it felt suffocatingly silent. The tension in the air was thick, each person seated around the polished mahogany table fully aware that the next hour would determine the future of the company. Outside, reporters crowded the sidewalk, waiting for news to break. Inside, Ethan sat at the head of the table, his face unreadable, though the flicker of tension in his clenched jaw betrayed his frustration. Across from him, Richard sat with an air of quiet confidence, fingers laced together, his expression almost bored, as if he had already won. "The agenda for today is simple," one of the senior board members announced. "We will vote on whether Ethan Caldwell remains CEO of this company." The murmur of agreement around the table was laced with unease. Ethan leaned back in his chair, observing the faces before him. Most of these men had once respected him, followed his leadership without question. But power had a way of shifting in unexpected ways. And now, they saw him as a liability, someone too unpredictable, too reckless. Richard spoke up, his voice carrying the practiced ease of someone who had rehearsed this moment. "Caldwell Enterprises has thrived under strong leadership, but recent decisions have placed us at risk. The hiring of an unqualified individual has caused significant disruptions, and our shareholders are concerned about the long-term stability of this company." Ethan exhaled slowly. He had expected this. What he hadn't expected was how many of the people in this room would be so easily swayed. Lisa and Daniel watched from the sidelines. They weren't allowed to speak, weren't even supposed to be here. But Ethan had made sure they had a seat. If he was going to go down, he was going to do it with the people who had fought beside him. Richard continued, "I propose that Ethan step down immediately, and a new CEO be appointed to restore investor confidence." The murmurs grew louder. The vote was coming. Ethan could feel the walls closing in. And then, the screens in the room flickered to life. A breaking news broadcast interrupted the stillness. The headline bold and unmistakable. Evidence of corporate sabotage uncovered at Caldwell Enterprises. The entire room stilled as the broadcast played. A well-known journalist appeared on screen, reporting on newly obtained files that exposed a deliberate effort to manipulate test results, discredit an employee, and undermine Ethan Caldwell's leadership. Documents flashed on the screen, email correspondences, financial transactions, all leading back to one name: Richard Powell. The silence in the room turned to chaos. Some board members turned to each other, whispering furiously. Others stared at Richard in shock. Ethan's voice cut through the noise. "Would you care to explain?" Richard, for the first time, looked shaken. His face paled as he shot a look toward his allies. But none of them met his gaze. The evidence was too damning. The timing too precise. He opened his mouth, grasping for an excuse. But before he could speak, Lisa stepped forward. Before you say this is some elaborate setup, let me remind everyone that all of this information came from Caldwell Enterprises' own internal servers. It was deleted, but not erased, she said, her tone razor sharp. You wanted Daniel Carter gone so badly because he was the only loose thread in your plan. Richard let out a strained laugh, shaking his head. This is ridiculous. This is nothing but a desperate attempt to shift blame. Ethan tilted his head. Then why do all of these records trace back to your account? The room fell silent again. Richard's mask of confidence cracked. Just slightly. Enough. One of the senior executives interrupted. This is serious. We can't ignore this. Ethan turned to the board. You were about to vote me out for endangering this company. Now, you know who the real threat is. The murmurs turned into decisive nods. One by one, the board members cast their votes. And the decision came swiftly. Ethan remained CEO. Richard was immediately placed on administrative leave, pending an official investigation. The moment security stepped forward to escort him out, Richard's composed demeanor shattered. He jerked his arm free, his voice laced with venom. You think this is over? You think you've won? His gaze landed on Ethan. Then Daniel, you don't know what you've just done. Ethan's expression didn't change. We're about to find out. Richard was led out of the room. And just like that, the power struggle that had nearly destroyed the company came to an end. But Ethan knew better than to think this was truly over. Later that night, he sat in his office, the city lights casting long shadows across the floor. The battle had been won. But the war was far from over. The people who had backed Richard, the ones who had orchestrated this from the start, they were still out there. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Daniel stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. Ethan gestured for him to enter. I assume you didn't come here just to enjoy the view. Daniel crossed his arms. I came for an answer. Ethan leaned back, studying him. To what question? Daniel exhaled, glancing at the skyline. I spent years on the streets, being told I was nothing, that I didn't belong anywhere. And now, after all of this, I need to know, what's next? Ethan considered him for a long moment before speaking. That depends on you. Daniel frowned slightly. You've proven yourself more than once. Ethan continued. I won't pretend like I hired you out of kindness. It was a gamble, but you've earned more than just a job here. He leaned forward, his gaze steady. So tell me, Daniel, do you want to stay? Daniel looked out at the city, the lights stretching endlessly into the night. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about just surviving. He was thinking about something more. The early morning sun cast long shadows across the gleaming glass facade of Caldwell Enterprises. The tension that had gripped the company for weeks had begun to ease. But remnants of the storm still lingered. Richard Powell was gone, but the damage he had caused was far from forgotten. The news broke before dawn. Richard had attempted to flee, but he didn't make it far. Authorities arrested him at a private airstrip just outside of Los Angeles, where he had been trying to board a jet bound for the Cayman Islands. The evidence against him was airtight: fraud, corporate sabotage, conspiracy. The charges stacked up, and by midday, every major news outlet was broadcasting his downfall. But Richard hadn't acted alone. The investigation spread, pulling in names that had once seemed untouchable: executives, investors, people who had hidden in the shadows while pulling the strings. Some cooperated, eager to distance themselves from the sinking ship. Others resisted, denying involvement even as records surfaced proving otherwise. Deals were made, reputations were shattered. Caldwell Enterprises had survived the coup. But Ethan knew that the war for control was far from over. Sitting in his office, he scrolled through the latest reports, his mind a blur of strategies and countermeasures. The board had ultimately sided with him, but not out of loyalty. Self-preservation had guided their votes. He had won, but at a cost. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Lisa stepped in, a folder tucked under her arm. Richard's arraignment is set for next week, she said, taking a seat across from him. Legal thinks he'll cut a deal. Ethan set his phone down. And the others? Lisa exhaled. Some of the investors behind him are already trying to reposition themselves. They'll deny knowing anything, claim they were misled. Ethan let out a humorless chuckle. Of course they will. Lisa hesitated, but there's something else. The legal team uncovered documents that suggest some of these power plays started long before Richard came into the picture. This wasn't just about taking you down. This was about control. Ethan leaned back, rubbing his jaw. He had always known that money dictated the rules of the game. But for the first time, he was beginning to understand just how deep the corruption ran. Caldwell Enterprises wasn't his, not entirely. There were people in the shadows who believed they owned it, and as long as he refused to play by their rules, they would come for him again. He wasn't just fighting for his position. He was fighting for the soul of his company. But that was a battle for another day. Right now, there was someone else he needed to see. Daniel stood near the massive windows of Ethan's office, looking out over the city. He hadn't said much since the vote. Lisa had been reinstated. The company was stabilizing. His name had been cleared. But the question that had been hanging over him since the beginning still remained. What's next? Ethan asked, stepping beside him. Daniel didn't turn right away. He watched the people below, businessmen, delivery drivers, street vendors, all moving through their own lives. For years, he had been one of the nameless figures on the sidewalk, overlooked and ignored. Now, for the first time in a long time, he had a choice. I don't know, Daniel admitted. I never thought I'd get this far. Ethan crossed his arms. You've proven yourself more than once. The offer still stands. Stay here, work with me, build something new. Daniel let out a slow breath. And do what, exactly? Ethan turned to face him fully. Whatever the hell you want. Daniel finally met his gaze. And what do you want, Ethan? Ethan exhaled. I want to change the way this company works. But I can't do it alone. I need people I can trust. Daniel smirked. You trust me now? Ethan shrugged. You haven't screwed me over yet. The room fell into a quiet that was neither uncomfortable nor tense. Just two men standing at a crossroads, both knowing that whatever came next, it would be something different. Finally, Ethan broke the silence. You could be anyone you want. Carter, you're not just some guy who lost everything. And I'm not just some billionaire who doesn't know what the real world looks like. Daniel nodded, his expression unreadable. I just want to be someone who matters. Ethan gave him a knowing look. You already are. The sun had fully risen now, spilling golden light across the skyline. Daniel turned back to the window, his reflection staring back at him against the backdrop of the city. At the base of the building, the entrance doors gleamed in the sunlight. He could walk through them, step into a new life, into something that had once seemed impossible. Or he could turn away, leave this world behind, and start fresh on his own terms. For the first time in a long time, the choice was his. The air outside Caldwell Enterprises felt different this time. Daniel stood at the entrance, looking up at the towering glass structure, remembering the first time he had walked through those doors. Back then, he had been nothing more than a man trying to return a lost wallet. A nameless figure most people wouldn't have looked at twice. Now, he wasn't just a survivor, he was someone who had earned his place. Ethan was waiting for him inside, standing near the floor-to-ceiling window that overlooked the city. The man who once saw the world through the lens of power and profit now carried himself differently. He had been humbled by the battle he almost lost, by the realization that control was never absolute. Daniel took a deep breath before stepping forward. Ethan turned, his expression unreadable. So, have you made your decision? Daniel nodded. I'll stay, but on one condition. Ethan raised an eyebrow. Oh, I thought surviving all of this was condition enough. Daniel's voice was steady. I don't want just a job. If I'm going to be here, I want to make sure others like me get the same shot I did. I want a training program for people who've been knocked down by life. Formerly homeless, veterans, ex-convicts trying to turn things around. People no one else wants to hire. Ethan studied him for a long moment. You realize that's not exactly great for business, right? Daniel didn't waver. Neither was keeping me around. A slow smile formed on Ethan's face. Fair point. He exhaled, rubbing his jaw as if weighing the idea. You're asking me to invest in people the world has already written off. Daniel met his gaze. Someone once did the same for me. Silence hung between them before Ethan finally nodded. All right, we'll make it happen. Daniel extended his hand. Ethan took it. This time, it wasn't a test, it was an agreement. A few days later, as Daniel walked through the halls of Caldwell Enterprises, he noticed the shift. Some employees still looked at him with curiosity, others with lingering doubt, but there was something else too: respect. It wouldn't be easy to change a company's culture overnight, but he had seen enough to know that real change was never easy. Not everyone was happy with his presence. The shadow of Richard's leadership still lingered, his influence woven into the way things had been done for years. But Richard was gone, and Daniel wasn't going anywhere. Lisa greeted him in the hallway, arms crossed. I still can't believe you convinced Ethan to do this. Daniel smirked. Yeah, me neither. She shook her head with a small laugh. You sure you're ready for this? He glanced around the office. At the people who had once dismissed him. At the place that had tried to break him. I think I've been ready for a long time. That evening, Daniel found himself back where it all started, Santa Monica. The same stretch of beach where he had once been just another face in the crowd. He walked along the boardwalk, watching the waves roll in, the lights of the city flickering behind him. He reached into his pocket, pulling out the watch he had carried for years. The glass was still cracked, the hands still frozen in time. For so long, he had held onto it like a tether to his past, a reminder of everything he had lost. But tonight, for the first time, he felt something different. He slipped the watch back into his pocket, not as a weight to carry, but as a piece of his journey, one that had led him here. To this moment, to this decision. As he turned toward the city, a quiet certainty settled in his chest. Caldwell Enterprises wasn't just a company anymore. It was a chance to do something real, to build something that mattered. And this time, he wasn't just passing through. Sometimes, the smallest choices lead to the biggest changes. Daniel Carter started with nothing, no home, no job, no second chances. But he didn't let the world define him. He proved that integrity, resilience, and courage can rewrite even the most impossible stories. What would you have done in his place? Would you have walked away, or fought for something greater? If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to Shadow Secrets for more tales of resilience, power, and the fight for justice. The next story might just change the way you see the world.